So, today I want to talk about child labor in Alabama. Yes, you did indeed hear that correctly. As it turns out, a subsidiary of Hyundai that produces car parts is alleged to have had children as young as 12 and 13 years of age working in their factory. The factory is operated by a company known as Smart Alabama LLC and is the primary parts supplier, from what I understand, for Hyundai in the United States. It is worth noting as well that Hyundai actually owns more than 50% of the company's Smart Alabama LLC, and therefore should have a lot of operating control in terms of how the company functions. So, before I delve into the story itself, I want to take a moment, and I think it's worth mentioning that we've actually been seeing a resurgence of companies in the United States trying to exploit the labor of children in order to avoid paying people a living wage. Now, I have covered this in a previous video, which I will link in the description down below if you want to check that out. But it suffices to say that many fast food restaurants have been putting up banners announcing their desire to hire children as young as 14 years of age. And children have really never also been exempt from working in the agricultural sector in the United States, and continue to do so quite often to this day. And just as an example, so you don't think I'm making this up or anything, this is an actual sign that was outside of a McDonald's in last August, now hiring 14 and 15-year-olds. And I talk about this again in the previous video that I mentioned in more extensive detail and the agricultural sector stuff. But this is what we're dealing with, and this is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds in the United States right now who are trying to hire people. So, with that all said, let's take a look at what exactly occurred in Alabama. So, we have here that according to area police, the family of as well as the family of three underage workers and 8 former and current employees of the factory, underage workers, in some cases as young as 12 years of age, had worked at the metal stamping plant operated by Smart Alabama LLC. Now, according to Hyundai and Smart, both of them have kind of taken this very corporate response of saying things like, oh, Hyundai does not tolerate illegal employment practices at any Hyundai entity. We have policies and procedures in place that require compliance with all local, state, and federal laws. It also didn't answer any of the detailed questions that they were asked. And again, similarly, Smart responded quite the same way. So it seems here that we have Hyundai and Smart both deciding to put forward, again, these corporate nonsensical responses that deny everything while remaining quiet so that they can't really say anything that might incriminate them in the future, even though a lot of this is pretty telling. Now, when we look a little bit further into this, we see that the company says it relies on temporary work agencies to fill jobs, and it expects these agencies to follow the law in recruiting, hiring, and placing workers on the premises. Now, what's very telling here is that these companies are using temp agencies as a form of plausible deniability here to continue to enable these practices. Many temp agencies, despite what they're saying here, can often be very lax with their hiring checks. And because companies like Smart go through these agencies, they can kind of claim, hey, I didn't know that this person was underage. I didn't know that this person working at my facility didn't fit the requirements. This isn't on me at all. And again, they can deny everything that's happening. And essentially, as I'm going to show a little bit more in a short while, this is them just finding a legal loophole in order to justify the exploitation of children. So, how did they find out about this particular case at this factory? Well, in February, a Guatemalan migrant child from her family's home had disappeared. She had, gone missing, and they called and tried to find and get the police to find this young girl. The girl, who turns 14 this month, and her 2 brothers, aged 12 and 15, all worked at the plant earlier this year. They were not going to school, and according to people familiar with their employment, they were essentially working these very dangerous jobs. So it turns out that the Police ended up finding her and bringing her home, but this ended up revealing all this information about the factory. Now, the thing is, and this goes back to what I was saying about how these factories must have known what was going on. If we look a little bit later in the article, we find that that these workers that were working at the factory when they were interviewed had basically said that there were approximately 50 underage workers that were working at the facility at different plant shifts. And this is absurd of them to try to cover this up, because all it takes is one or two people that you interview to find out how much nonsense they're spouting. Another former adult worker at the place said that she worked alongside a dozen minors on her shift. After former employee worked at Smart's assembly line for several years through 2019, the person said the plant had high turnover and increasingly relied on migrant workers to keep up with intense production demands. She said she remembered working with one migrant girl who looked 11 or 12 years old. And I'm sorry, there's no way you're going to tell me that the facility didn't know that a bunch of 12-year-olds were not adults. That, these are jobs that require an adult to manage really dangerous machinery. And you're going to tell me that they couldn't tell that a 12-year-old was in fact not an adult? And to make matters even more obvious, after the disappearance of the young girl generated local news coverage, Smart actually dismissed a number of the underage workers. And according to two former employees and other locals familiar at the plant, this is how they treated those kids that they had basically been employing. So what you're telling me is that once the police's attention was raised and that they feared that the authorities, that the police would actually potentially, crack down on this, not that they were able to, but we'll get to that in a moment. You're telling me that this facility somehow didn't know that a bunch of 12 to 15-year-olds were in fact children, and then somehow managed to fire all the underage workers at once they thought they might have gotten caught. It seems quite apparent, if we put all that together, that they knew what they were doing. Now, when it comes to who has jurisdiction and control over this, it turns out that the police department that found the young girl actually didn't have jurisdiction. So they passed on the information to the state's attorney general's office after the incident. And at this current moment, it's unclear whether the office or the investigators have actually contacted Smart or Hyundai about the possible violations. And a spokesperson for the Alabama Department of Labor had said it would be coordinating with the U.S. Department of Labor and other agencies to investigate this further. However, I'm going to be real about this. I highly doubt any of this is going to come to anything. There is no way in my mind that the Alabama Department of Labor didn't know about, if not this incident, then a lot of incidents like it that are occurring and continue to occur to this day. Just because we've uncovered this one incident doesn't mean that it's not happening all the time. And I guarantee you also that it's not the first incident that they've seen, because Reuters, who leaked all of this information, also had recently exposed a story featuring a 16-year-old who was working in a meat production facility in Alabama and was underage and, doing a job that he wasn't supposed to be doing. So what I really expect here is that this company will get a slap on the wrist and will be told to keep it quieter next time and make sure that information doesn't get out. There's no reason why it should have to take a missing child to uncover all of this information. There should be investigations into these type of situations. Now, keep in mind that this is also the exact same facility that has a documented history of health and safety violations, including, quote, amputation hazards. Take a moment for just pause on that, right? Think about that for a moment and let those words sink in. These plants are already dangerous for adults, like I mentioned previously, to the point where there are amputation hazards. These machines are not meant to be operated by children for any reason. And even with all these violations, this facility, this factory, has somehow managed to not only stay in operation, but is actually considered, according to this very article, to be the flagship of Hyundai in the United States. Now, I just need to stop for a moment and remind people that unions would have made all this exploitation far more difficult. If you have a bunch of people organizing and trying to look out for workers, it becomes far more difficult for a company like this to continue to, do and have all these safety violations and to actually hire minors because the union would call out the practice. Unions protect workers in ways that companies definitely will not. Now, here we have another response from Hyundai that I wanted to highlight for a very specific reason. They said, in a human rights policy posted online, Hyundai says it forbids child labor through its workforce, including suppliers. Now, I need to address this. Unfortunately, unless Hyundai has plans to overturn its class interest and become a force of radical change in the globe, there's no way it's clean from child labor, no matter how much it may profess this position online in order to seem credible to people. The fact remains that while this is shocking to many in the United States that it could be happening here, this is actually a normal part of life for many across the globe. Imperialism, colonialism, and continued exploitation by first world nations incentivizes and maintains the conditions for child labor globally. The migrants in this story are originally from Guatemala, a country that's been ravished by U.S. imperial practices and unsavory trade agreements. A nation where child labor exists in the production of many products, including coffee. And when we look at it, these are cars that are, incorporating more and more smart technology as we move forward. And when we look into that, lithium and cobalt production are well documented as being mined with child labor, meaning that the overwhelming majority of modern technology that's produced today is actually tied to this vile practice of child labor. A need to drive down costs under capitalism will always emphasize the exploitation of the most vulnerable populations, and children will be counted among them. Now, when we look further into this, there's this last section that Reuters goes into where it says, at a time of U.S. labor shortages and supply chain disruptions, labor experts told Reuters there are heightened risks that children, especially undocumented migrants, could end up in workplaces that are hazardous and illegal for minors. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of companies that are starting to look in this direction in order to avoid paying people a living wage. And I need to reiterate this, that there is no labor shortage, even with what Reuters is saying here. I've talked about this before. There is no labor shortage going on. There is a wage shortage going on. Instead of framing these companies as victims, we need to recognize this for what it is. Just as we see down the entire supply chain of global capitalism, companies are unwilling to spend what they need in order to pay for the products that they want to produce. They will seek out populations that are more vulnerable and more easily exploitable rather than paying a living wage that already removes, honestly, a significant amount of the value that workers put into making products. The same market incentives that are causing companies across the globe to exploit children, they exist here in the United States as well. They didn't just disappear here. People don't just realize that these incentives exist globally and they're universal under this system of exploitation and capitalism. And I need to emphasize that while I don't think Reuters meant anything, horrible by it, that the writer here didn't mean anything horrible by it, when they say that migrants could end up in workplaces or that, children could end up in these workplaces, I need to remind you all that people don't just end up in these workplaces. It's part of a global system of exploitation that's produced by capitalism. In this one small story that we're examining from Reuters, we're seeing a small window into a much larger picture that actually involves the entire global economy. When the goal of all of this is making profits over everything else, we really shouldn't be surprised when companies try to hire vulnerable populations, including children. Their goal is to make profits. So why are we shocked when they do everything in their power to give the greatest return to their investors and to provide record-breaking profits that keep increasing quarterly returns? Now, bringing things back to this particular story for one moment and coming back from the large global view that we just looked at, I want to remind people of who the real victims in this circumstances are. The workers, and especially the children who are consistently exploited by these companies, are the real victims here. These children were denied access to go to school in order to take dangerous factory shifts. Thankfully, some of the children that are involved in this story will actually be able to go to school and get an education next year. Whatever you might think about education in the United States, it's certainly better than what they're doing in these jobs. However, while these type of situations remain invisible, many more children will be denied access to education and a decent childhood, largely due to economic need and the companies willing to exploit that need. Situations like this will continue cycles of poverty and exploitation that will continue as long as we keep enabling a system that preys on vulnerable populations instead of trying to develop a system that looks out for the common welfare of people across the globe. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you watched here and you enjoyed the content that I produce, do consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as consider joining my Discord where we have conversations on topics like these. If you happen to be in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please also consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube. Just the mere mention of child labor is almost guaranteed to have this particular video removed. The links for everything that I mentioned are in the description down below, and with that said, my name is Anarchist Terra. Thank you so much for watching.